Okay, great, awesome. Thank you so much, and we apologize for the technical difficulty. Hopefully you enjoyed that comic entertainment to lighten it up and get us started. And we're so happy that you're able to join us today for part one of our two-part webinar series focused on closing the opportunity and skills gap by connecting education to employment. Just very briefly, at Schools That Can for the last decade, we have worked to unite leaders to expand quality urban education. Over that time, we have built the largest cross-sector network of schools in the country. Our network currently consists of 149 nationally validated schools, schools from all sectors, including charter, district, independent, and faith-based, that serve high-need population, yet are meeting or exceeding expectation. In recent years, we've engaged in some deep reflection on what do we mean when we say quality urban education. Early on, we relied heavily on quantitative metrics, performance on standardized assessments, graduation rates, attendance rates, etc. But disheartening data in recent years has helped us see that this is not enough. Passing tests and graduating high school no longer means that you are ready for college. Though the high school graduation rate hovers around 80% nationally and at 60% in urban centers, only about 8% of low-income students make it successfully through a four-year college to get a bachelor's degree. And moreover, amongst all young adults with bachelor degrees, including those from both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, about half are un- or underemployed. This clearly shows that our traditional metrics of success are not sufficient benchmarks for predicting future success. We have to go beyond expanding existing quality. We must innovate and create new metrics of success in order to close the opportunity and skills gap. As such, STC has begun building partnerships with innovators like Breaker to highlight new approaches to 21st century teaching and learning in order to provide students with exposure and access to different pathways beyond K-12 and to help them develop critical skills that will prepare them for those pathways. To this end, we are so thrilled to bring you this important conversation about how to better prepare students today for jobs of the future. Today you will hear from Juliette LaMontagne, founder and director of Breaker. Since 2011, Breaker has been training young people between the ages of 14 and 25 with high-level employable skills like communication, creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking. They introduce students and educators to creative and collaborative problem solving and entrepreneurship by taking on local, national, and global challenges, which lend immediacy and purpose to their learning. Most recently, they challenged a team of high schoolers to participate in a 2-week challenge to solve for food waste. You'll hear more about that project today and in depth next week. Tony Wagner is a renowned speaker, writer, and thought leader in 21st century learning. Personally, I was introduced to his work back in 2010 when I read Global Achievement Gap as part of an education policy fellowship. In this book, Tony identifies 7 survival skills, core competencies necessary to flourish in the dynamic and innovative world that is the 21st century. Quite honestly, reading this book rocked my world, and I questioned the standards that I had been taught and was applying in my classroom. I introduced our executive chair, Michael Druckmann, to this book when I joined Schools That Can, and we have closely followed Mr. Wagner's work ever since. This summer, we hosted a small screening of Most Likely to Succeed, a documentary that highlights effective practices to help students develop passion and purpose and cultivate critical skills that will prepare them for jobs of the future. Mr. Wagner was a key player in the production of the film, as well as co-author of the book by the same title. It is truly an honor to introduce you to Tony and Juliette. Thank you for joining us. We were going to say that you could post your questions in the comment section below the video, but the technical difficulty is we can't have that open while we're recording. So if you have questions, please email them directly to me at clamb@schoolsthatcan.org. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the screen over to Tony.
Or me.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So first, thank you, Casey, and all the folks over at STC doing important work to change the conversation in education by bringing stakeholders across private and public and charter. And it's a much-needed conversation and a sharing of best practices. So thank you very much for including us in the webinar series. I'm also very pleased to be here with Tony Wagner, friend and Breaker advisor, thought partner. Tony and I met back in 2012 when we were both invited to speak at a TEDx event in Brooklyn, and I was so excited to share the stage with you, Tony. The Global Achievement Gap was a foundational text during my days at the International Study Schools Network, and then by the time you published Creating Innovators, I had recently launched Breaker, which I saw as the embodiment of everything you were talking about in that book, and I couldn't wait to hear you have my talk, and I told you as much the morning you arrived, and you were like, oh yeah, sorry, I have to be off to catch a plane, I'm not going to be here this afternoon. So you didn't hear my talk, but I was not dismayed and reached out, and we've been in conversation about Breaker and all things education ever since. So thanks for being here today.
Great pleasure. It's just huge fun to look forward to a conversation with you, Juliette, as always.
Great. So some people may or may not be aware that you are a former school principal. And so I have a question for you, which is, if you were to wake up and out of this dream of being a celebrated author, and you were instead still the principal of that, I think it was a middle school outside of Boston, and am I correct?
Yeah, yes.
So what would be the first thing you would do as the steward of students entering the innovation economy, given what would be your limited degree of power and autonomy in that role?
Great question, and a really important question, because actually I think principals have a little more kind of opportunity to innovate than they sometimes give themselves credit for. Mm-hmm. The first thing I would do is launch a conversation with my entire school community about how the world has changed and what do we need to do differently to best prepare kids for this new world. You know, what I found over and over again, Juliette, as have you, I know, is that so many people living in the midst of change can't step back and see it clearly. So most people don't understand that we've transitioned from a knowledge economy to an innovation economy, and the kids need to be very differently prepared. So I think the first challenge then is to start with a series of adult conversations with teachers and parents and community members about how the world has changed, and given those changes, what should a diploma mean from our school? What should our students know and be able to do? What are the skills and dispositions that are critical to thrive in this new era? And then once we've done that, I think we can turn the problem back to educators to think clearly about, all right, if these are the outcomes that we all agree on, what do we do next? How do we need to change teaching and learning? How do we need to change assessment?
So let me get into the nitty-gritty that we know is kind of the reality of the school day. What minutes in the day would you allocate to those conversations? Do you imagine that this is kind of informal coffee talk? Are you dedicating professional development hours to these conversations? How do you think about time?
I don't think we can make these conversations just something teachers voluntarily drop in for. I would structure them around professional development opportunities. I would hold a series of evenings with community members. I would reach out and do focus groups in community associations, churches, community centers, and so on. And so be much, much more proactive, and would not assume that people, like parents, would necessarily want to come for an evening. We would go out to them. We would do the focus groups and talk about how the world has changed. We would produce materials. We would do interviews with employers about what are the skills that matter most and make sure they're up on the website. We would do book studies. We would obviously promote and encourage a film screening of our recent film, Most Likely to Succeed. In fact, the primary purpose of making that film was to provoke exactly the conversations I'm talking about.
So you know at Breaker that we talk about closing the gap between education and employment and having just those conversations that you mentioned with industry folks and community stakeholders. So I'm curious to know, in your book you talk about the Committee of 10, the high-powered industry leaders who in 1893 set the course of American education to meet the needs of the industrial era. You know, given Alphabet's you know, in their Google's motto used to be "Do no evil" or "Don't be evil," and Alphabet has since kind of moved away from that. Would Google have a place at the table? Would, you know, who are those 10 in your mind, or who needs to be part of the conversation about closing that gap?
Wow, what a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that question. It never occurred to me. This is what I adore about talking with you and about the work you do. You always bring a fresh insight and perspective to the work. But, you know, I think that's a really interesting question I'd have to give a lot more thought to. I don't have a quick answer for that. But the short answer is I would definitely want Laszlo Bock to be a part of that conversation, because he, as Senior VP of People Operations at Google, he's been incredibly articulate about the transition Google has made from hiring kids on the basis of a diploma, and only those from Ivy League degrees need apply, to hiring kids on the basis of structured interviews where they're looking for evidence of core competencies. That is a radical shift, and it's not just Google that's doing it, but they were probably the first, and Laszlo Bock is clearly one of the most vocal in that shift.
Interestingly, another shift happening, a greater number of colleges adopting portfolios as an alternative to standardized testing for admissions. What kind of feedback are you getting from higher ed folks who are perhaps linked to admissions, and how are they thinking about portfolio work? Have you gotten any response to that?
I would like to see that accelerated radically. In fact, my challenge that I lay down for admissions officers in college is, all right, let's do a modest experiment. Why don't you just admit 10% of next year's freshman class entirely on the basis of their portfolios? Just try it. Because they all complain, of course, you know, it's very, very time-consuming and very, very subjective. Everybody wants to say that human judgment is far too subjective. Test scores are so much more objective, more meritocratic. Well, that's baloney. You know, collective human judgment, informed by evidence, is, in fact, the best tool of assessment that we have. Far better than any kind of standardized test, anything that can be measured by a computer. So my challenge to colleges is give it a try. And I don't see enough yet willing to do that. Now, more and more are moving away, as you know, from requiring standardized tests to being so-called test optional. In fact, 850 colleges and universities today are test optional. Very, very good schools: Bates, Bowdoin, Colby, Middlebury, Mount Holyoke, and so on. But I want to go beyond test optional. You know, the world no longer cares how much our kids know. What the world cares about, as you know, as Breaker knows, is not what they know, but what they can do with what they know. So let's shift our admissions criteria to really begin to reflect that changing world that we all see around us.
And are you getting feedback around your stance on portfolios? As you know, we have at our organization experimented with portfolio-based assessment, and to your point, it's complicated, it's a heavy lift, they are labor-intensive, and they're difficult to ultimately evaluate. What have you learned in conversations with educators who are trying to implement portfolio-based assessment?
Well, there's a little bit of history here that's quite interesting. You know, you go back to Vermont in 1991 and 92. Their assessment statewide accountability system was entirely based on portfolios. And it was groups of teachers assessing the next district's over's student work. So, you know, it was a part of teachers' work to assess their neighbors' student work. So it was not such a huge additional burden. It was a part of the system. Now, along comes Rand Corporation. They do a study of it, and they say, well, it's not valid or reliable. Why? Because teachers didn't have enough training. So it was given up. So I think the challenge here is to structure portfolio review into the school day as a part of teachers' work or school year, and to ensure that teachers have adequate training so that there's what we call inter-rater reliability. Now, you are thinking, I think, breaking new ground with Breaker, where you're looking at using devices to actually measure what people are doing as they do it. I think that's extraordinary. I can't wait to see the results of that. Tell us more about that, can you? What you're doing and what you're learning.
Well, are you referring to the Sociometric tools?
Yes.
Is that what you're thinking of? So this is just in concept phase because we haven't even prototyped it yet. But it's true. We have been using portfolios for a number of years and finding that it's a great metacognitive tool for sure. It is a great way to get kids thinking about formative pieces of artifacts, evidence of learning over time. But it is, in the end, difficult to get a 360-degree review of each student's portfolio. So what we ended up doing is saying, okay, yes, we teach all the 21st century skills, but in fact, the ones that are most important to employers, therefore those that we're going to double down on, are creativity, communication, collaboration, and critical thinking. So that helped just to create a tighter frame on the artifacts that students were gathering. And once we did that, we were able to say, well, what's the best way to make sense of all of this information at a glance? So we've created a kind of a data visualization tool which creates kind of a visually concise portrait of students learning over time on a continuum. And then you can, of course, because it's a digital tool, you can compare students easily and visually and compare students' growth throughout one of our challenges. So that's one piece. And then the sociometric piece is kind of our aspirational assessment prototype. We're looking to measure what matters, communication, collaboration, creativity, by using these sociometric badges, which can capture passively information like gestures and proximity and voice, and create data portraits of what kind of communicator you are and what kind of collaborator you are and so forth. But again, we're just beginning to explore that.
I think the challenge with either kind of assessment, whether it's using these just in real-time devices or portfolios, is first, as you said, to narrow down what it is in fact you want to assess. But then the next challenge, I think, is a definitional challenge. What is critical thinking? You know, it's a buzzword for us in education, Juliette, as you know. Everybody says, oh, well, I teach critical thinking. Oh, our school district does critical thinking. But when you ask people to define it, they can't. You know, the definitions go all over the map. So I think the challenge is to get much clearer, particularly.
And to your point, agreed,
yes.
Agreed. And so to your point, we have narrowed those behaviors that represent creativity, communication, collaboration into observable behaviors. What is observable with the eye, audible with the ear, such that we can evaluate a student on a continuum of emerging, developing, proficient, advanced, as well as the student can self-assess themselves. So as much as possible, like, yes, these are to a certain degree intangible elements, these soft skills, but we have tried to lend language to the behaviors that will help us to track them and support growth.
I think the challenge is to create clear performance standards and to share those with kids so that we have evidence of what good communication looks like, oral, written, and listening, what good collaboration actually looks like in practice, and of course critical thinking and creative problem solving, so that students have a range of exemplars that meet a certain performance standard to which we've agreed. And then I think setting that standard involves bringing in outsiders. So I take a page from Deborah Meyer's book, that wonderful progressive educator whose work I know you know. She used to invite college teachers and employers in to randomly audit her graduates' portfolios. They pick a portfolio at random to audit and say, does this meet your standard for college ready, for work ready? If not, why not? So I think that dialogue back and forth with outsiders who can help us establish clear performance standards, which we can then communicate to our students, is very key in all of this work.
Agreed. I also think training them in the rubrics actually lends a framework for thinking about their behavior. Each of our lessons is tied to different behaviors within those rubrics, and each day students are made aware of, we are going to be evaluating for this, that, and the other thing. Now, of course, you can always game the system, and because you know you're being looked at for empathy this day, perhaps you're exhibiting certain behaviors to call that behavior out. But, you know, with the best intentions, we are providing a conceptual framework for students to improve along these, in the development of these skills.
How much have you thought or worked on the idea of giving the problem back to students, saying, all right, here are our performance standards around the 4 C's. So what we want you to do is select your best work through your portfolio, through written work, through videos, whatever, that you think that shows evidence of mastery. You know, part of this whole portfolio process, that I think is so important, which my friends at High Tech High talk about, and we capture in the film, is the idea of students having to present and defend their work, having to do exhibitions of mastery for real audiences. And I know that's exactly what Breaker does. So that's, to me, part of the challenge here is engaging students where they're actually having to think about, well, which piece of my work best shows my capacity to do X?
We have the added benefit of having creative output. So every design challenge ends in a culminating presentation, which is a pitch of a product or a service. The quality of that creative output is in large part a result of the effectiveness of their communication and collaboration skills. So it ramps up to creative output, and we're able to both measure the output, the outcome, and say, well, isn't it interesting that the groups that communicated most effectively had the most creative output as rated by a community, a panel of experts.
So now I have a question back for you. The question most frequently asked when we talk about the 4 C's with educators is, yes, but how do you do collaboration? You know, in my classes, it's one kid doing all the work. So what's your response? How do you deal with that? How do you assess collaborative skills? How do you ensure that everyone is contributing to the team?
So my first answer to that is project work, right? Deep, immersive project work. And what I mean by that is not a 45-minute period or even a 90-minute block, okay? Project work that happens over a 2-week period. You know that expression, train as you fight in the Army? Well, we learn as we would work, which is to say people work on intensive projects, and they work in solo and group modalities throughout that project. They burn the midnight oil when they have to. They, you know, recharge whenever they need to. They take bathroom breaks as needed, right? So we want students to be able to learn as they would work. Within that collaborative structure, there is plenty of solo work, right? But you have to be able to allow kids to flex in and out, to move in and out of different styles and different ways of working depending on the needs of the larger collaboration. So in other words, it's not just about this moment is a collaborative moment, this is a collaborative project that's going to require a lot of different modalities within it.
I love that distinction between a collaborative moment. You know, we're doing group work for the next 15 minutes, kids, and a collaborative project over 2 weeks. I think that's an incredibly important distinction. Right.
So there will be moments when I drop the ball, but somebody else picks it up for me, right? So not everyone is going to perform equally. Fair isn't always equal. You're going to bring your strengths, and they're going to be needed on Thursday until 1 o'clock in the morning, but the next day you're going to pull back. So the whole idea of like, well, that kid's not pulling their weight, or you know, how do you assess kids when they're all on different tasks? You have to have the long view there.
Yeah. Do you have teams do 360 reviews of one another's contributions to the work?
We're working on it. We haven't gotten there yet, but yes, that's
New Tech High folks whom you might want to talk to have, understand, built that into students' assessments of every single project. They're routinely doing 360 reviews. I think that's another key to this, frankly.
I agree.
There's much more accountability for, in effect, coaching and assessing one another.
I agree. I agree. So I want to be mindful of time, and I want to make sure that our listeners have a chance to ask some questions. So I guess, Casey, how is this going to work? You're going to chime back in and let us know what people are thinking about out there?
Yes, I have a few questions that I'd like to pose to you, Tony, and the first one actually is a personal question. So I'm reading your book, Most Likely to Succeed Now, and I know you talk about how it's a myth that if we fix low-income schools in low-income communities, then we'll fix the education problems in our society. And I think it's clear that the skills gap is a problem that affects everybody. But we have also seen that a lot of well-resourced schools are innovating quicker than the under-resourced schools. And so I'm wondering, I think that the opportunity gap is going to exacerbate the skills gap in the near future. And I wonder, how do you propose we work to attack both the equity issue and the skills and quality issue?
Casey, that's a really important question. You know, I want to be clear. I think there are 2 gaps in American education. One is the gap we know well and have been talking about for 20 years, though we've made almost no progress. And that's the opportunity gap, as you're pointing out, between the kids who are disadvantaged in various ways versus middle-class kids. But my point has been that if we merely aspire to bring disadvantaged kids' achievement levels up to middle-class kids as measured by test scores, we're going to leave all of our kids behind, all of them, because they will be prepared for the 20th century, not the 21st century. So there is a much larger, bigger problem in education, and it will not be fixed by incrementally improving existing systems, which are a century old. We have to reimagine education for an innovation era, and that's why I love working with folks at Breaker, because I think they're doing the educational research and development that's required, that is a part of a reimagined education system. The other thing, Casey, that I worry that we don't talk about enough, and that's the simple issue of childhood poverty. We are not going to solve this first education gap, this so-called achievement gap, without addressing issues of poverty. And it just concerns me deeply that our childhood poverty rate is 22%. Nobody talks about it. The actual percentage of kids who are homeless has gone up in the last 5 years. And do we hear a single mention of any of this from our politicians? Nothing. Zero. So my ultimate concern is that we're asking educators to fix societal ills. Now, there's a great deal, as you know, as your association already has done, to prove how much in fact schools can do. But schools cannot be expected to fix poverty. That's a bigger issue that needs to be addressed. Okay,
thank you. The next question I have is from Sanda Balaban, who is the Executive Director of the Governor's Committee on Scholastic Achievement. And she's wondering sort of what is the role for school-based employees versus folks who work outside of schools. So how can adults beyond school help to cultivate the skills and dispositions that are essential for college and career success?
Well, I absolutely believe that every kid should have an internship. All middle school students should do job shadowing. All high school students should be required to do a semester-long internship. And in fact, that is a graduation requirement at High Tech High. And it's incredibly important that kids get out there in the world and explore what might interest them, and that sometimes they discover that what they thought interested them, in fact, doesn't. That's an important discovery. But more importantly, I think they're often discovering what are the skills that matter most there in the big world. And so that is a way that all kinds of adults can be more directly involved in nurturing and mentoring kids. Sign up to offer an internship.
Great. And then looking at schools a little bit more specifically, have you seen what are some successful non-traditional models that you have seen for career day type programs? And that question comes from Kristen Harris, who's the Director of College and Career Readiness Supports at the New York City Department of Education.
I can't point to any particular models for career days. Again, I think the longer term opportunity is to bring many more employers into the schools to talk about the nature of what they do and how they do it, not just for a day, but as a part of the social studies curriculum. See, the problem with having a day of anything is that it becomes trivialized. And it's a check. We check that out. Oh, we did Career Day. We did Martin Luther King Day. You know, that's a part of the problem in education. We don't integrate the things that matter into the academic core content. So all of these things ought to be integrated into social studies.
Great.
Just one quick example. When I was a 9th grade high school English teacher, one of my English requirements was that students go interview people in a workplace setting and job shadow for a day, and then come back and do an oral and written report. And so you had, 30 kids reporting back to one another about the day, who they shadowed and what they learned. So that's, to my way of thinking, is the way you, as an example of how you bring this back into the curriculum, and you don't sort of wait for a special day that comes and goes with very little real attention being paid.
So these are all great ideas. They definitely do require some restructuring of schedules. And so another question we have is what advice do you have for schools who are looking to do more of this project-based learning, getting kids out of the building, interacting with the community? How can they sort of adjust the traditional structures and schedules in school in order to allow for this kind of learning?
Well, there are a lot of examples, if you go on the internet over the last 20 years, of different kinds of schedules. The Coalition of Essential Schools which was started in the late 80s by Ted Sizer and colleagues, many of those schools developed alternative schedules. Fundamentally, they involve larger blocks of time with team teaching. So, for example, at High Tech High, which is featured in our film, Most Likely to Succeed, you have 2 teachers teaching a total of 4 subjects to a group of kids over a 2.5-hour period. So you have a teacher who's teaching humanities, you have another teacher who's teaching physics and some math and or engineering. So when you've got a 2.5-hour block of time, it suddenly gives you tremendous flexibility. You can have kids go off campus for a half day if you get that block of time. Also, with smaller schools or schools within schools, teams of teachers have a great deal more flexibility. And also, obviously, the added benefit is personalization.
Yeah. Can I add to that? Mm-hmm. So some of our school leaders are finding the opportunity to, say, in the 9th grade, what you would call an orientation experience, run a design challenge, or use the January intersession or testing week for students who aren't taking the test, whatever year that might be, capstone kinds of experiences. Basically, we're encouraging school leaders to think of any unit of time that can stand alone for deep, immersive project work, especially as an introduction to the school, if that, in fact, is part of the DNA of the school. So yeah.
So let me just build on that, because I think that's incredibly important work. But just give an example of the larger shift. What if we defined a high school diploma as a collection of merit badges, as a certificate of mastery, not a certificate of seat time served? And so there'd be merit badges for critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creative problem solving, maybe entrepreneurship, a merit badge for thinking scientifically, being able to do research like a historian, and so on. And obviously you could get more than one merit badge for a certain project. Then we said, all right, students, you can earn this merit badge in any number of ways. You don't have to be in school to earn this merit badge. You could be working on it over the summer. You could be working on it on vacations, on the weekends, through internships, through work study, job study, whatever. So the point here is, it's not just rethinking, how we divide up the school day, but rethinking the very nature of the school day and what, in fact, is the ultimate outcome of that school day. So if it's merit badges, as in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, suddenly learning can be 24/7, 365, and doesn't always have to have it in a classroom with a teacher.
Great. And then a last question. I think it's really powerful conversation that we've been having here about sort of what matters, and how do we measure what matters, and how do we shift the structures in place that in order to facilitate learning of what matters. But we know that we do still now live in the time of accountability and state standards and tests and whatnot. So what advice do you have to schools to sort of, or how have you seen schools balance the accountability with the innovative out-of-the-box thinking?
Well, first of all, what we know is that if you give kids work worth doing, that's intellectually challenging and rigorous, they will, in many circumstances, actually outperform a test prep school. So it is a matter of giving kids challenging intellectual work. This is not, let me be really, really clear on this. This is not about skills versus content. I'll be very clear. Content matters. It matters that kids know what's going on before them to orient themselves to the world. But skills matter more than content, and motivation matters most. Because if you're self-motivated, you will continuously acquire new content knowledge and new skills. So we need to use rich and challenging content to teach skills. We need to give kids work worth doing. And the schools that do that, and there are more than 500 that are a part of the Deeper Learning Initiative. Go to deeperlearning4all.org to get a list of those schools. The schools that are doing that are not having any problem meeting the requirements for accountability because they're going so far beyond those minimal requirements. They're not doing test prep, where so often kids hear one thing and it goes right out the other ear. They're immersing kids in really rich, challenging, and interesting work, and so are able to meet those standards, but then holding themselves to a much higher standard. Whether or not all kids graduate, in fact, number one. Graduate college and work ready, number two. So in holding themselves to a higher standard, they're able to at least meet the minimum requirements of the state accountability standards.
Great. And we did just get a last question, but I know that we're about to run out of time, so we'll see if maybe we can answer that question offline. But thank you, everybody, for sharing your questions. Thank you, Tony and Juliette, for sharing your wisdom. This has been a really engaging conversation, and really, I think it's great to sort of set the stage also for some of the I know, great programming that Breaker is going to be doing this year, some of the work that we're going to be doing. Perfect segue that you talked about deeper learning, because we're doing a professional learning group with high schools to integrate deeper learning techniques in our Chicago programming, and we read the book as a team last year for our book club. So a lot of really great food for thought, and also concrete strategies and ideas that were shared here, so thank you. And then just a reminder that next week at the same time, Wednesday at 4 p.m., we will be doing part 2 of this webinar, and during that time we'll have the chance to dig in deeper to see what Breaker's design challenges look like, specifically looking at the Future of Food project that they did out in Portland, Oregon this summer. And Gina Condon from the Construct Foundation will be joining us, and she is a community leader who really helped to sort of gather support so that Breaker could facilitate the kind of conversation that you were mentioning early on, Tony, about really bringing the community into the conversation to say what are the things that matter and how can we help students develop these skills. So thank you again, and we will hopefully see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.